Welcome back to the Codex. Today we're talking about the 5 new Incarnons that we just recently received as essentially part of the Kome update. This is the new Week 8 Incarnon rotation, which involves the Sybaris, the Sicarus, the Okina, the Cestra, and the Dera. And I'm going to be showing all 5 of those, showcasing how good they are, explaining how they work, their unique Incarnon mechanics, and I'm also going to give you my opinion on the order in which you should take them, given the fact that there's 5 weapons, but you can only get 2 per week. Unless, of course, you just buy them outright. But we're assuming they're going to be actually farming them, so I'll give you my opinion on what order to farm those in, essentially. Now, first, let's talk about the testing methodology. I actually built a new Revenant just for you guys so that I could have a Revenant that doesn't have any shards in. And I also made sure the arcanes are not buffing arcanes, like there's no weapon buffing occurring from these arcanes. None of the mods on buff weapons. I do have Roar on, but I just won't use it unless I want to showcase what that's like, obviously. The Aura mod is not a damage buffing Aura, so on, so on. So nothing about this frame, unless I activate Roar, will buff the weapons. I'm also not using a companion that buffs anything. I'm using just the Helios with no weapon equipped. I figured, hey, if I'm not going to use a companion, I may as well just throw on Helios and maybe get some extra Codex scans that I still need. And on this actual Helios build, there's again nothing on here that would buff my weapon damage. None of the bond mods that do anything. No Tenacious Bond, no Reinforced Bond. Which, speaking of that, keep in mind throughout this test that while I'm not using Tenacious Bond and I'm not using Reinforced Bond, typically you would be, probably on something like a Panzer build, for example, which can utilize both. So the power level that you're about to see from all these weapons is without the extra 1.2x crit damage multiplier that Tenacious Bond gives, and for the guns, without the 60% extra free fire rate you can get from Reinforced Bond. So as good as these weapons are about to look, keep in mind that you can make them even better just by having a real companion on, essentially. So let's start off with the Sybaris Prime. Actually, we'll go over the Incarnon evolutions first. So what the Incarnon mode actually does is that it converts it from a 2-round burst into a 4-round burst, and it gains guaranteed blast status on those shots, which is very interesting, and we'll talk about that in a moment once we get to the actual build. For the first evolution, I chose the Blazing Barrel, which gives you 5% extra multi-shot, stacking up to 10 times while you're firing, which means that it gives you 50% multi-shot essentially. This does reset, but it is able to you'll build it back up like instantaneously, so it doesn't matter. This also, since it's multi-shot and multi-shot counts for the individual headshots that you land to charge up the Incarnate form, this does let you get back into that Incarnate form faster, which is the main reason why I like to use it. For the second one, we're using the minus 60% recoil, which when you get to minus 100% recoil on this weapon, which you'll see that I do in the build in a moment here, it turns into a complete just blasting laser beam, and it feels incredible. That's my favorite one here for this choice. And then for the last one, we are going for the base crit chance increased by 5% and base stats by 10%. I'm assuming that either this or this has a typo on the description, because if you look at this Survivor's Edge, it gives you 5% crit chance and 10% status chance, but if you look at Elemental Dominance, it says that it gives you 5% status chance, which is doubled to 10% in the Incarnate form, because it says effect to double in Incarnate form, which means that in the Incarnate form you get 10%, but this one says that it gives you 10% in both, but also 5% crit chance. So, at least according to the current wording, I'm not sure why you would ever take Elemental Dominance, because it's strictly worse than Survivor's Edge, assuming that this isn't a typo. So take Survivor's Edge for now, and then looking at the actual build, we'll go down to the Incarnate stats here. You see that the Incarnate form actually loses crit chance over the regular form, although you do gain a good amount of crit multiplier, so that's interesting. Now you'll notice here that even though the Incarnate form says that it causes blast status, it doesn't actually do blast damage. The interesting thing about the Incarnate form of the Sybaris is that it does not add blast damage, it just guarantees a forced blast status on the burst, which is actually very strong, and it's extremely consistent. I mean, you will constantly be setting off the 10-stack blast explosions, so I wanted to buff that up by building for Viral, so that even if I just apply a single viral proc, that'll double the damage of those blast AoE explosions. And typically you'll be doing a lot more than one viral stack. You'll do a full 10 very often. As you can see, our status chance is 96% per projectile, and when you account for multi-shot, that is a lot of viral. Now, given the forced blast of this weapon, primed shred, in my opinion, is a must slot on this weapon. Adding that punch through, along with the fire rate, of course, being a DPS increase, but adding that punch through means that when you shoot into crowds, you're setting off a massive amount of those forced blast explosions. And another excellent thing about this weapon causing forced blast damage, blast status rather, is that since the AoE from this weapon is blast status and the weapon itself doesn't actually cause an AoE effect, like the 4-round burst of the Sybaris Incarnon is not actually an AoE, but you get that AoE type effect from blast status. It means that galvanized aptitude works in this weapon, because galvanized aptitude does not work on AoE weapons. It doesn't scale the damage of actual AoE explosions on things like the Kubazar, for example, but blast status isn't an AoE, it is a status effect. So this fully scales it, which means you get a lot of extra base damage to scale up that blast status damage formula. And the rest of the build's pretty simple. Due to the fact that we do only have 90% crit chance with critical delay, I am using galvanized scope, so the actual crit chance of this weapon is going to be 186% once you get the stacked up all the way, which is much more damage, and it means that you're almost entirely orange critting. And we are using primary deadhead, which gives us another minus 50% recoil. When you pair that with the minus recoil evolution, this means that we have minus 100% recoil, and as you'll see, it turns this thing into a laser beam of death. And we're running the, of course, classic choice of Vigilante Supplies and the Exilus to give us that little bit of a crit buff from the set effect there. Now let's go on to the Sicarus Prime. The most important note about this weapon is that right now, I'm going to show you how it performs, but this weapon is currently bugged. It seems to potentially have the same bug as the Telos Boltor Incarnon did, or maybe still does, where it does exponentially more damage depending on the amount of ammo left in the Incarnon magazine. So it's literally hitting sometimes for like 60, 100 million damage. So it's obviously way accidentally overtuned right now. So the performance you're about to see is not indicative of the actual expected performance. And at some point, I imagine soon, they're going to be fixing that. But given the base stats of this weapon and the fact that it has the ricochet rounds in the Incarnate form, the same way that the dual Toxicist and the Lato do, I imagine this will still be a very high-end, popular meta weapon. It'll still be very popular. So just keep that in mind. You're about to see a very overtuned performance. Before I forget, let's show the evolutions here. So for the first one, I'm going for the increased base damage by 35 and plus 40% damage to enemies below half health. The other one is very interesting. It increases your base damage also by 35, but it makes you not able to crit on body shots, but you get 150% extra crit chance on headshots. So if you want to go really hardcore on being accurate and really landing those headshots consistently, this is a enormous damage increase, but only for headshots. So keep that in mind. For the second one, I'm using the plus 50% reload speed. This is really nice because it's not conditional. It's not after reload or reload on empty or anything like that. It's just a flat, always active plus 50% reload speed. And that's really nice because reload speed affects the animation speed of switching into your Incarnon form. So it makes the weapon feel more streamlined to use. The last one here, I'm using just the crit increase of base crit chance, 14%. The Survivor's Edge is also a super valid option. It gives you 9% base crit chance and 9% base status chance, especially if you were doing something like a blast build, for example. I would probably actually switch to this. That'd probably be worth it. That's a very valid choice. Now, the actual build here, we're using a fairly generic corrosive heat build. If this weapon were to stay as overtuned as it currently is, I would actually drop Galvanized Shot for Seeker, and honestly, even after they fix it, just given how strong the weapon probably will be, and the fact that it has those ricochet rounds, you really get a ton of value from punch through, because every enemy that you hit, when you punch through and you hit multiple enemies, each of those enemies will cause that ricochet to occur again and again and again. So if you want to, you can replace Galvanized Shot potentially with Seeker just to get a ton of those ricochets to go off. Since we're using heat damage, I do have Cascadia Flare on. You could also consider using a Deadhead to combine with Steady Hands, get that minus recoil up to 100%, and again, also turn this into a laser beam. So you do have some options there. Aside from that, fairly generic corrosive heat, just raw damage and crit setup. Now the Okina, this one is really interesting. Let's go over the Incarnon evolutions here. When you go into the Incarnon form, it gives you the normal plus 100% melee damage that all the melees get. You also get the 20% sprint speed and 20% parkour velocity. And the unique effect is that kills generate spectral daggers that target enemies, applying a max cold status stacks. So very interesting effect. You kind of have these hunter daggers that work alongside you as you get kills. For the first evolution here, I love this first evolution. It gives you extra 20 base damage, and on critical hit, you get plus 6% status damage for 10 seconds, and it stacks up to 5x. This means that this gives you 30% status damage, which is extremely potent because we're going to be using, as you probably guessed, a melee influence build. Now, for the second one here, if you want to do max DPS, you want to go for Orkin Reach, because this is the only one of the three that actually gives you a like a kills per minute buff of any kind, which is the +1 range here, especially because I'm not using Prime Reach in my build, so this is the only source of range. Another potentially valid option, though, would be the combo timer pauses when weapon is holstered. If you want to have this weapon always available as like a 12x murder stick that you can quickly switch to and have it still be at 12x, even if you haven't used it for the last 10 minutes because you've just been using guns, you could potentially take this and maybe whip this out when an Acolyte shows up, land a few hits, maybe trigger that TennoCreate, get a free heavy attack off, still have it be at 12x, and then switch back to your guns for another 20 minutes or whatever before you go back to it. That's also a valid option depending on what your playstyle is. For the last one here, rather than taking the crit buff, I actually took the increased base status by 12% and the 25% status duration. That extra base status by 12% is super, super good for a melee influence build, because if we go into the build here, once you account for the conditional status buff of Weeping Wounds and Galvanized Elementalists, which is one of the new mods in the game, this is super good, along with Galvanized Steel. But when you combine the Weeping Wounds plus Galvanized Elementalists, when these are stacked up all the way, these give you a ton of extra status chance. You can see here it says I have 36% status chance. That goes all the way up to 237% status chance when you're at 12x combo, which you will be at 12x combo the entire time because this is a combo influence build. You can also see that it says the critical multiplier here is 2.6. It's actually going to be 5.72x because Galvanized Steel has conditional crit damage on kill. So you're just not seeing that crit damage here because it's conditional. And your actual crit chance will also be 195%, even without that extra 6% base. So you're still hitting basically entirely orange crits, even with taking the status evolution. And the reason I did that is to make those melee influence procs super consistent, and you really pump out that electric radial DPS. It's super good. Now the rest of this build is most of the mods that you would expect for a fairly generic melee influence setup. Condition Overload is wildly effective on this build because even though you can, on the build here, you only see Impact, Puncture, Slash, and the Electric that I've modded on, but it seems like the Spectral Daggers actually scale with basically all of your melee mods because I've seen they apply every single status. They don't just apply max cold stacks. It also seems that that cold damage combines with the electric from Shocking Touch, and it also applies magnetic, and I've also seen them do Impact, Puncture, and Slash. So they do guaranteed cold. They also do magnetic because it has direct hit damage of the cold combining with the electricity to be magnetic, and then it also does the Impact, Puncture, and Slash. So in total, you actually have Impact, Puncture, Slash, Electric, Magnetic, and Cold. So Condition Overload with 6 different stats effects is giving you 480% base damage, which is obviously fantastic for scaling the damage up here. Now, we do still have a Smite mod on. Every time that I show an influence build, I always use this, and it's because these mods triple dip. So if you're using a primed Smite mod, for example, This is actually a 370% damage increase for melee influence because this 1.55x is triple dipping. If you don't want to use this, then just slot in Organ Shatter, because as you can see, we're not using Organ Shatter in this build because I've dropped it for Galvanized Steel, because Galvanized Steel, which recently came out, is a direct upgrade over Organ Shatter for combo builds, because Organ Shatter is 90% crit damage. This is 120% crit damage and 110% crit chance. So this is a extreme upgrade over Organ Shatter, but just slot that right back in if you hate smite mods, and you'll be good to go. Now, since this is a primary, a secondary, and a melee, I'm just going to go do one mission, and I'm going to showcase all three of these together. And yeah, as you're about to see, they're fantastic. Let's hop into a Lua Conjunction Survival on Steel Path. It'll be around level 200 enemies.
Life support.
All right, here we go. We're going to start off with the Sybaris. We'll just go in order here. Right now, this is the regular non-Incarnon form. Let's switch over to the Incarnon, and you'll see that we get a lot of AoE damage from those 4 splash procs. And the punch through from that Prime Shred, like I said, wildly enhances the utility of this weapon. Being able to set off multiple of those 4 splash procs per burst is a just enormous crowd DPS increase. And that fire rate, of course, also makes the weapon feel much better. And again, this is without Tenacious Spawn and without Reinforced Spawn, so it could be even better than you're seeing here. This weapon does take a while to charge up the Incarnon form, I'll say that. If you get like a ribbon, for example, with multi-shot, it does feel a lot better if you're fortunate enough to get that. Otherwise, it takes a good amount of headshots to charge up. But once you get into that Incarnon form, as you can see, it completely shreds. It's incredible. It's actually one of my new favorite weapons, to be honest. It feels so good to use, and it performs so well. And as you can see with that minus 100% recoil, it's like you're shooting a laser beam. You can really beam those heads and really benefit from that primary deadhead arcane that you have on for that extra 30% headshot damage, which does scale up the splash procs, by the way. So that's another damage multiplier to add to the mix. Alright, let's switch over to the Sicarus here. And like I said, this thing is super overtuned, so don't expect this damage to stay the way it is. Now let's switch to the Incarnate form. Yep. It kills everyone. You'll randomly see like 70 million damage pop up every once in a while. Like it'll say 500k and then it'll say 70 million. It's a bit bipolar in that way. See if I can get one of those crazy hits here. Yeah, I think I just saw 4 million in the mix somewhere there. You see kind of mixed in with the more regular looking numbers. Let's see here. Yeah, it completely shreds. The fire rate is also ridiculously high for not even having reinforced spawn on, I gotta say. Now, with those ricochet rounds, you can see what I mean about how if you can get either punch through on a ribbon, if you get a ribbon, or if you decide to slot in Seeker over, for example, a galvanized shot, you can really get a lot of increased effectiveness from those ricochet rounds from hitting multiple enemies. There's a 1.1 million hit. Same way the dual Toxicist really likes punch through, and the Lado. There's a 3.3 million hit. Yeah, you can see. Really just get some really bursty damage numbers on this, with no Warframe buffs and no ribbons. So this is definitely going to be patched to fix whatever kind of scaling issue it has, making it way stronger than it's supposed to be. Let's whip out the Okina here. These things are extremely fun. You'll see once I get them all the way up to 12x here how nasty they are. Alright, about to activate the Incarnate mode in the moment here. Once I get a free TennoCreate hit, go. Now we have the Incarnate mode active. And you'll see on kill I create these daggers. Yeah, this guy right here who's got impact, cold, electric, and magnetic on him, that was all from the daggers. It is ridiculous how much they are able to spread status, and that wasn't even at 12x. Let's go ahead and get the 12x and show how absurd it is when you have all that crit chance and status chance stacked up. Now, the only thing I'm running for combo right now is Naramon, so I'm losing 5 hits every 5 seconds, because I don't have any combo duration on and no arcane dexterity and whatnot, so if you really wanted to use these super effectively, I would recommend that you run primary and or secondary dexterity to get up to another 15 seconds of combo duration. Yeah, this Acolyte's not going to like these at all, I can tell you that. Goodbye. But yeah, with extra combo duration from primarily those arcanes, you can make these much more consistent in terms of keeping that extra crit chance and status chance. You can see even without it, I'm having a hard time building it because they kill so fast against even level 200 enemies. So I'll keep trying here to build this up, but those melee influence procs combined with those cold daggers that you generate really just kill everything around you. Hello, Thrax, how you doing? I noticed that this melee seems to only have a 90-second Incarnon form as opposed to the longer one that I think the Kratos and the dual Ichor have, for example. Not sure why they did that, but just make sure that you actually stay in that Incarnon form and don't accidentally go around meleeing in the regular form, because then you won't have those nice cold daggers doing all that work for you. Yeah, we're at 12x now, and you can see you do some real good damage, and those daggers put in some work. They apply a lot of extra status for you, and all that extra status that they apply means that you're getting, like I said, massive utility out of that condition overload setup. You're getting huge damage scaling to buff up those melee influence, spreading damage around the map as you spread those electric procs. You see guys get frozen around you, so thanks to those daggers, you're also getting some crowd control added into the mix along with that extra damage. So they even help with keeping you alive in a mild way. Alright, well those are excellent. Let's go back to the ship here, and we'll go over the Dera and the Cestra. Alright, so we're down to the last two Incarnons for the week. The Dera and the Cestra. Now, in my opinion, compared to the first three that we just showcased, these two are kind of the black sheep of the week. As in, they're the worst of the 5 Incarnons, but they're still good, in my opinion. Like, the Incarnon upgrades really do beef these up, and they actually make them relevant to at least the point where you can use them without it feeling terrible. So the Dera, the Incarnon form, what it does is it turns into basically a higher damage magnetic railgun, is effectively what it does. But the interesting thing about the Dera is that I actually potentially like the main fire better than the Incarnon fire, kind of like how the Felarch's shotgun mode is actually better than the Incarnon dual pistol mode, because so the first evolution here on the Dera, it gives you increased base damage by +6 and on kill plus 20% ammo efficiency for 5 seconds, stacks it to 4x. So when you stack this up all the way, which is very easy, you get 80% ammo efficiency, which effectively multiplies your magazine size by 5, because you only spend ammo once every 5 shots. That's what 80% ammo efficiency means. But ammo efficiency does not work on Incarnon forms, so if you didn't care about that, then go for the other one here, which gives you extra fire rate. But if you combine this ammo efficiency with this second perk, which one of the ones you can pick gives you an increased base magazine capacity of +30, +30 magazine capacity multiplied by effectively 5 due to 80% ammo efficiency is actually the equivalent of 150 extra rounds. So you can fire the main fire for a extremely long time, and it's a bit funny and actually effective. And for the last mode here, we are using increased base critical chance by 25% of current status chance up to 35%. So basically it means that your crit chance scales with your status chance. And on my current build, this actually gives more crit chance than the base crit chance and base crit damage modifier here. So this is quite interesting. Let's go into the actual build here. And speaking of that crit chance, that brings the crit chance up to 157.5%, and the critical multiplier is 6.6. So this is, again, a fairly normal corrosive cold build, thanks to the large amount of different damage types here, at least, well, especially if you're on the Incarnon form. It does make Galvanize Aptitude effective. Even on the non-Incarnon form, you still have Impact, Puncture Slash, Corrosive, and Cold, so that's 5 different stats types to scale up Aptitude, so very much worth using. Prime Shred here on the main form, with how much you can fire and how fast it fires, makes this way more effective in crowd. So again, just like the Sybaris, I highly recommend a Prime Shred for the punch through that it can give you. The rest of the build, like I said, fairly normal, not much to explain there. Let's go over the Cestra. The Incarnon mode of this makes it so that the longer you fire uninterrupted, you get higher and higher crit chance. And it's a pretty fun gimmick. You do get up to where you're doing essentially guaranteed red crits. So especially towards the end of the magazine, you actually are pumping out some pretty notable DPS. Now the first evolution here, this one is very dependent on your play style and the frame that you're choosing to play as. So one of the choices here gives you increased base damage by +10 and with armor over 450, plus 80% multi-shot. So you have to have 450 armor or higher to benefit from this. But if you do have that, I would probably recommend this just because it's consistent. You don't have to do anything to activate it. It's not conditional, I mean, aside from having the armor. But if you have that armor, there's no other condition that you have to trigger in the mission, and so you just have passive 80% multi-shot. And again, since it's multi-shot, that will help you charge the headshot meter faster, because each individual multi-shot counts towards the total amounts of hits needed to charge up the Incarnon form, so that's super good. The other form here is more damage, way more damage, because it's increased base damage by +10, and on shield or overguard break, you get ×3 critical damage for 6 seconds. So if you have a build where you will constantly have shields or overguard breaking, like maybe from, if you use a Dante Spectre, for example, that's constantly giving you overguard, but you're on a high-level mission, so enemies are constantly breaking through it while you regen it from kills, this would be a huge amount of damage. Now, since I am using Revenant as a test frame, well, actually, neither of these apply to me right now because he has less than 450 armor, but I'm also not going to take damage because I'm going to have Mesmer on, so the damage that you'll see this do would actually be even higher depending on what frame you're playing as, because right now I'm basically not benefiting from this at all. Now for the second one, I'm taking the projectile speed because this is a weapon that has flight time, so taking this just makes it feel better. And then for the last one, we're taking the increased base damage crit multiplier by a +2x. I did the math, and this is slightly better DPS than the 18% increased crit chance, at least on this specific build. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to hop into the Kuva Fortress actually for this one, because the tight hallways will really show you how effective these weapons can be for crowds of enemies, given just the nature of how they work. So let's hop over there on Steel Path and showcase that. Thankfully, there actually happened to be a fissure up at the moment, which means that the enemies are higher level than normal. They're level 160 to 170 starting off, which makes the viability of the test even better, because, you know, we're testing against hardier enemies, so just keep that in mind. Alright, so Dera here. Take a look at how long you can fire this for once you get these first few kills stacked up. It is extremely funny. The second magazine will be better because the first magazine didn't have all the kills charged up. So here we go. So this 90-round magazine is basically 5 times larger. So instead of 90, it's like, what, 450 rounds, basically? Yeah, this is actually hilarious. This is like the Needler from Halo. Now let's showcase the Incarnon form here. So even on this build that isn't really built into maximizing the Incarnon form, you can see it still is able to do some work. This guy's blocking my shots. Why am I not hitting? I feel like I'm...
Get ready for a capsule.
I feel like I'm not doing the damage I should be doing right now. Interesting. So yeah, not great. This build is really more meant for spamming that main fire. It's also a very accurate weapon, as you can see. It's almost literally a laser beam, so you can really beam heads to benefit from that 6x damage multiplier on critical headshots. And yeah, you can just fire away, basically, with this ammo economy that those evolutions that I chose gives you. Now let's pull out the Cestra here. Yeah, we'll go to the Incarnon form. And you'll see here, I start off with yellow and orange crits, and then you go into orange and red crits. And then towards the end of the magazine, you get more and more red until you're basically entirely red crits. So just like it said, the damage really ramps up the longer you fire it. So maybe when you're getting towards the end of that magazine, if you see an Xmas on screen, for example, focus those last few rounds on the Xmas to really burst them down, because those last few rounds are going to be the ones that do the most damage. It's a modifier like this that makes me wish magazine capacity worked on the Incarnon form, because then you could build into magazine capacity in this weapon, and that would basically be the same thing as building for more crit chance, because it would let you build up that bonus longer. But even so, with the limitations the weapon has, not being able to mod for that, it's an interesting weapon. It's maybe a little gimmicky, and it's definitely not as good as the Sybaris and the Sicarus and the Okina and whatnot, but like I said, these both can perform well enough, especially when you keep in mind, like I keep saying, this is without Tenacious Bond, this is without Reinforced Bond, and this is without any Warframe buffs. So this would be much better if you were playing the real version of the game, basically, where you're not nerfing yourself for the purposes of showing the weapons in a vacuum. So if you like how these weapons mechanically look, if you like the flavor of them, just remember that you can make them a lot better than I'm showcasing here. Now let's hop back to the ship. So, those are the 5 new Incarnon weapons for Week 8. But the question remains, what order would I personally recommend taking them in? Well, let's go over that. As you could probably guess, Week 1 for me is the Sybaris and the Sicarus. Even with the Sicarus definitely having a nerf incoming, just the base stats and the mechanic of the ricochet rounds that it has pretty easily puts it in the top 2. And then for Week 2, I would say the Okina and the Dera. The Okina was an easy choice, just because as you saw, that was easily the top 3. The melee influence dagger hunting setup that it has is very good, so that made it the easy choice for Week 2. And the Dera, for me, the Dera is above the Cestra in my opinion, just because I like the needler effect that you can get with the huge effective magazine size. It's just kind of funny, honestly. And then that leaves the Cestra for the 3rd week. So that's the order that I would take those in. That's what I think of those weapons. Hope you guys like the showcase. I'm going to be doing a video like this for each week for all of the other 7 weeks, so that by the end of this coming 2-month rotation, basically, I should have a video out on all 8 weeks. If you guys thought that this was helpful, then consider dropping a like and subscribe. It really helps a ton. It helps the video get out there to more people. It helps the channel get out there to more people, and I greatly appreciate that. Let me know below, do you guys agree with my ranking, essentially, of these weapons? Do you think that these new Incarnons are exciting, or do they bore you? How do you like the mechanics? I'm always interested in your guys' input. Thank you as always, and I'll see you in the next one.